As you saw, I've got a pretty massive fuel leak from my E30. So the first thing I did was to take off the seat cushion on the back seat, and that just comes off by pulling on it. And that exposes these two hatches, and one of it, the large one, exposes the fuel pump, while the small one just exposes some fuel hoses. With the hatches off, I could do a visual and a touch inspection, and that showed that these two areas were bone dry and there's no fuel leaking from these two areas. So that brings us back to our prime suspect, which is this really torn up looking hose itself. But there's no access to the top of this hose, so we need to drop the fuel tank. So to make it a lot simpler than it actually was, first you have to detach the exhaust, drop the exhaust, and then you have to drop the prop shaft, which involves a battle with 4 prop shaft nuts. You can see it in another video here. And then finally you can remove this filler hose, which connects the fuel filler to the fuel tank. And lastly, there's I think 6 or 8 bolts holding the fuel tank in place. So you just gotta undo those bolts and you can start dropping the fuel tank. Of course, you should keep a hydraulic jack under the fuel tank so that you can drop it gradually instead of having it fall to the ground after you remove all the bolts. My tank unfortunately got stuck on this fuel filler connection, so I couldn't drop the whole tank but had to drop it at an angle, which was enough for me to replace the leaking hose, so that's fine. So we know there was a leak around this area here, from around here actually, somewhere above this hose. And looking at the top of the fuel tank, you can see this general area where I think the leak is coming from. It's actually dry and dusty. So I mean, if the leak was from here, I would expect the dust to have been washed off by the petrol, but there's still all dusty here. But this part is clean, and there happens to be a hose connection here, hose to hard line. So that's my prime suspect for the location of the leak. It's a rubber hose, a bit old and cracked, and the rubber on top is all cracked, torn. So I think I'll just replace this section of hose. I've got some brand new hose here. It's not metal braided, it's just a rubber fuel hose, but hopefully that will do the trick. It's basically a really simple plumbing job. You just loosen the hose clamp holding the existing hose, and then pull off the old hose, and you push in the new hose. Careful not to damage or crimp the new hose. Push it in, slide new hose clamps on, tighten the new hose clamps, and then you got to lift the fuel tank back up into place, which will then let you connect the new hose to the other end of the hard line. Seems like a success. So now all I have to do is button it up, and that would be tightening up the fuel tank again, putting the prop shaft back on, putting the exhaust back on, and tightening up the sway bars again, and putting the fuel filler hose, attaching that back to the tank. And that's it. Finally fixed my fuel leak issue.